I will assume, probably correctly, that most of you do not know what SunShot Initiative is, and it's one of the rare times that I get to talk to an audience that doesn't know what it is, so that's actually interesting and fun. But also, one step back, I am not in the US at the moment, and so I don't know how many of you know what US Department of Energy is. Department of Energy is what would be called Ministry of Energy in other countries very often. It doesn't have the same function that a lot of other ministries do in the world, so we do very little rulemaking, standard setting, and in general have very little regulatory power. Department of Energy funds a lot of R&D. Office of Science funds about $4 billion worth of work in science in general, energy related or not. The applied energy programs fund another $4 billion. Half of that is about right now in renewables, put things in perspective. And then we also manage the entire nuclear weapons complex. So that is also part of the Department of Energy. Where SunShot fits in within the Department of Energy, SunShot Initiative itself is meant to span work that goes on in the Office of Science and the Solar Energy and Technologies program, which is where I sit, and ARPA-E, which is a separate part of DOE that is not tied thematically to any one technology. And so when we started SunShot a couple of years ago, the situation really was that the cost of solar energy, and I'll discuss metrics in a minute, was several times. It was basically the levelized cost of electricity and the capital cost for installing a PV system or a concentrated solar thermal system is going to be really high compared to anything else. The geothermal came close to that. It was higher than nuclear at the time, assuming certain programs availability. And so the goal that we set out at that time under Secretary Stephen Chu was to reduce the cost of solar by about 75% by the end of the decade. We got rotten tomatoes thrown at us by the industry. One could argue, and people do argue now, that it was visionary, that it helped the industry realign itself and think about faster learning curves and cost curves and so on and so forth, but we were not liked for that target. Really, ultimately, and this is just to come back to some of the other numbers that you heard before, what we wanted to do with setting this, and I'll talk about $1 a watt a lot. $1 a watt is just a number that I think, because the industry uses it, a lot of people track it and follow it. It is stuck around. The real metric comes from 5 cents kilowatt hour, which is the overall levelized cost of electricity that involves a lot of different things. I won't cover everything that it involves, but it is the cost of baseload power produced by coal and natural gas, mostly in the United States at least. I personally would like to see cost of solar go even lower, so that it's a no-brainer what you're going to install tomorrow. So when we talk about these numbers, these are the targets for utility scale power, so wholesale utility scale power. Jeffrey Kinsey mentioned earlier that we're already at grid parity in a lot of places in the world. We are at grid parity at retail electricity rates. So this means what you pay as a consumer, whether you're a commercial entity or a homeowner. And in those cases, and I'll discuss some of those numbers as well. But this target that I'm mentioning here, $1 a watt, 5 cents, is for utility scale solar power. Why is it SunShot? SunShot was meant to be the Apollo mission of our time. I was not around when the Apollo mission happened. My understanding is that it energized the scientific and technological community in the United States, certainly quite a bit. It funded a lot of research. We are not aiming for the scale of billions that went, or today's dollars that went into moonshot at a time, but we did get a lot of support, and we continue to get a substantial amount of support, clearly under the current administration that luckily stuck around for another term. And so we had a very clear mandate and very clear support, both in terms of the budget and in terms of the priorities within the department and within the administration. So when you're in DC and you're trying to execute these programs, that is very important. Broader mandate. So what do Americans in general think about solar power, right? In fact, it turns out that as recently as March this year, it doesn't matter where you live, it doesn't matter how you identify politically, turns out that Americans think that we should place more emphasis on domestic energy production, and in fact, solar power tops that list, well above domestic natural gas or anything else. So we have a broad mandate. What are we going to do about that? Is it actually that happening? Is that enough to take over the world, or at least take over the United States with solar panels? It's not. And so what can DOE do? What can SunShot, given our limited tools, really limited tools? We can't set policies. We don't set policies such as feed-in tariffs or even investment tax credits and so on and so forth. All of that comes from congressional actions. We fund programs. And the way we do it is by funding technology at various stages of development. The program is roughly, technologically speaking, divided into the photovoltaic programs. That is Photovoltaic R&D. That is my group. And again, I have a team of incredibly smart and talented, incredibly hardworking people in running these programs in photovoltaic R&D. There's also our counterparts in CSP have brought in a real rock star from the academia to run that program, and that program has shifted from doing large demos to doing more basic science work and understanding materials. Both of those technologies are addressed through two other teams that deal with systems integration for power electronics and grid integration, and soft balance of systems, which really means everything but what I mentioned. Not the module, not the power tower, not the inverter, but everything else. And I'll talk about everything else a little bit later, because that's becoming much more of a headache that's even harder to address. And very recently, we also formed a tech-to-market team that I also had, and I do wish that was the only one, but I still have photovoltaics in my court. So tech-to-market is really meant to be fairly opportunistic, cross-cutting initiative to see where we have holes, where we can accelerate commercialization and validation of technology across the entire spectrum. So mix in a little bit of each of these programs, because the other piece of the equation that dictates our daily life is that we don't ever get questions from the Congress that say, how do you guys work together? We always get questions that say how you separate your money so it doesn't ever touch. So that when you're trying to address market adoption in the soft cost area, it's not mixed with the development for the module, for example. So tech to market is supposed to mix it all together. The programs that, and you're not meant to read any of this, right? The way we run these programs, right, is, and I think the process is actually kind of important to explain. Every entity, in fact, now that includes national labs, it wasn't the case with national labs before, gets their funding through a competitive process. We come up with a theorem that says we should be funding, physics of reliability for the absorber or for microinverters or anything of the sort. Usually we do internal pitches to filter some of those topics. Then we have workshops with the external community. It's very important to validate our hypothesis of whether or not this is something that community needs to fund, whether or not there's a real gap, and what are the topics to address, and how to set the right metrics. Following that, we issue a paper. It's called Funding Opportunity Announcement that says here's how much money we intend to spend on these topics. People send in applications, and then we engage the peer review in selecting the awardees. So this is also a very important part. We don't, there's some government agencies that select it only through the program managers. We engage peer review. And then if it's filtered ever at the agency level, it's filtered by saying, oh, look, we've already, the peer review panel may have said that, I don't know, Song has a great idea, but look, we already are funding him for that, and so we're not going to fund him for the same thing, for example, right? So that's the process, and these funding opportunity announcements usually are tied to our funding cycles, but we do try to catch the trends in industry and try to fund the thing that is necessary. May you live in interesting times and have to catch that strategy and change it in solar on a monthly basis, these days at least. So I will start with something that is less familiar to me, that is probably not familiar to you very much at all, but describes, because I will dive into much more detail on the PV side, it describes how we actually address these costs, how we try to target these funding opportunities We break down, in this case, this is concentrated solar power, right? So this is a usually reflected light that is concentrated, and it heats a fluid, either directly creates steam that runs the turbine, or it might, in some cases, heat the a fluid that might actually be used for storage, so molten salt or something like that. So there are multiple configurations, and one of these configurations, in any case, the part where you're collecting the light, in this case, it's called solar field. There's a power plant part, the heat transfer, thermal storage, and so on and so forth. So concentrated solar power breaks down the components that contribute to the cost of the overall system to get to that target, and tackles each of these separately, and tackles each of those separately through a different funding opportunity announcement. In some cases, it's about integration. It's about how do you assemble the system on site, and in other cases, and here are some of these examples because you are mostly scientists, these are examples of actually materials research that was funded and awarded a couple of years ago. In some cases, we have the low melting point eutectic salt for storage. We have different materials for the reflector and so on and so forth. So this is an example of what is happening in the CSP space and what our colleagues there are funding. Back to PV. Similar to the CSP, clearly a PV system looks different. The PV R&D does limit itself, and it has in the past limited itself to the module only. Module has also been a really, really large focus area because it used to be the dominant part of the system cost. And I'll get to that in a minute later, that it's not the case anymore. But there are still challenges and things that we need to be working on. However, we're also designing hybrid programs to address multiple areas. So in the PV space, we break down the cost into 4 large areas. As I mentioned, a module, power electronics, the balance of system, hardware parts, so this would be racking, wiring, so on, and then the non-hardware, which is everything else. So in the module space alone, this is just showing the cost, the system price, cost where we started when SunShot started, what the goal is, and so for the module that I'll spend most of the time talking about, the goal is 50 cents a watt price. Okay, and I'll get to that in a minute, what that means, so not cost, price. In the normal world, that would mean well above the cost. But what is actually happening? So when we started SunShot Initiative, and I don't know if anybody's shown these curves yet, this is basically experience curve, but what it really tells you is how the price of PV modules has changed with, in this case, with time. Usually these curves are shown with volume, and so that's why they're experience curves. But in any case, the business had gone on as usual on the curve that we had for PV modules. We would have been looking at $1.50 selling PV modules at $1.05 in 2 years. Okay, so this year, this used to be, I used to say now spot prices are showing up at about 60, 70. It's not really spot pricing. I'm hearing regular reports that PV modules are being sold for about 60 to 70 cents a watt. Okay. 50 cents was our target. And so I'm about ready to fire my entire team, right? We should just all go home. And I mean, ultimately, yes, I would like to displace myself out of this job. But the issue with this is that what's happening right now is not sustainable, and it's not going to get us to the SunShot goal. And we'll get to that in a minute without some serious work. So back to how are we actually going to get to that SunShot goal, and what are people in the field doing? So I will get back to some of those cost targets and analysis a little bit later, but I'd like to spend more time first, because I think it's more important to describe what it is we fund across the entire space. So the programs that I'll be describing right now are starting from the earliest stage applied research. We don't fund basic research. We are not allowed to fund basic research. The Office of Science is not allowed to fund applied research, interestingly enough. So what we did was set up a program that funds people who are working in the Office of Science basic research facilities. So there's huge facilities that DOE, other parts of DOE and National Science Foundation have set up synchrotron and molecular foundry and a number of other facilities tied to national labs or not, that where you can study materials, where you can use the facilities for new kinds of experiments that you just didn't have maybe space for. We are tying that funding to the users of those facilities, and what we're also trying to do is tie the community that is doing very, very basic materials research with PV in mind. And so this was the very first, so we're compelled and now in a habit of giving cute acronyms to our programs that spell out something that hopefully is about that program. So BRIDGE is bridging that gap, basic science and applied science. Going up the, now again, it's not, the program called Next Generation PV doesn't really go up in technology maturity, but it used to be our earliest stage program, and it addresses a lot of things that are not mainstream, they're not addressed in mainstream PV work. So the examples of the things that we fund, actually you have heard and you will hear today. We don't fund only pyrite, so both Matt Law's work and Song's work is funded under Next Gen PV, but it's only one of the earth abundant materials are only one of those themes. We're also looking at trying to find interesting ways of either engineering or understanding the materials to get closer to the thermodynamic limit of the material, for example, single junction. This program did not yield as many of those projects at that time, and I'll talk about another program that was designed to address that in a minute. Advanced light trapping schemes and so on, but it was really meant to be a kitchen sink of novel ideas, novel materials, and novel ways of manipulating light that you're not catching thematically in any of the other programs. And so it is a program that we are cycling every other year and hoping to continue doing that. For those of you who may want to collaborate with US researchers at early stage programs, we do allow foreign collaboration with a certain limit on how much funding goes on. So Ted Sargent, also from Toronto, is funded under Next Gen program, for example. Going up and addressing still research, but more in the sort of mainstream materials set, if you will. The program that we started about 3 years ago, called FPACE, now it's FPACE 1 because there's an FPACE 2, is foundational program to advance cell efficiency. This is a chart that was the snapshot in time for the efficiencies for PV materials that were being manufactured at the time. And so what you're looking at here is a typical production or a module efficiency that you were getting from silicon, thin film, amorphous silicon, no PV, and so on. What the laboratory record for the cell was at the time, and then what the theoretical maximum was. This program was really meant to focus on bridging the gap between a hero cell in a lab, typical cell efficiency in manufacturing, so that's one gap to close, and then closing the gap between the loss you get from cell efficiency to the module efficiency, right? But it was research, and under this program, so under Next Gen, we mostly fund universities and national labs. This program has teams from industry, national labs, and universities. And again, it's a mix of technologies. So the important thing that is, it may surprise you, but was important for SunShot, setting that cost and performance, so the cost metric of $1 watt or 5 cents a kilowatt hour, it actually includes performance metrics. It includes minimum 21% efficiency. It includes 25-year lifetime and so on and so forth, certain assumptions. That is a technology agnostic metric. And that is very important for us because we can't, there are definitely, and there have been cases of unexpected trends that have not allowed the agency to react fast enough to shift the funding. And so just saying, make a case for this target and just do it with any material you can. Might result in less OPV funding because we don't have case for 25-year lifetime as an example, but there are other reasons to still study OPV that are captured in other programs. What we did not address at the time is the gap between, and this is more obvious, more latently obvious for the thin film materials, is the gap between hero cells, the best performing cell that was made in the lab. So this is the ideal condition. You really threw your best stuff in. You used E-beam for lithography. I mean, you did everything impractical. and you still are not close to the SQ limit, or not as close as, for example, as silicon is. Silicon, I mean, there's a number of reasons for that, right? Silicon, single crystal, we don't have single crystal CdTe and CIGS. Silicon is a well understood material because of the microelectronics industry and so on. So the program that we launched this year, and we're in the process of selecting the awards now, we've titled it FPACE 2, but it's really meant to study model systems to understand how to bridge that gap. And I think it's important because there's always this promise of, and in the space of thin films, for US, it was a competitive sort of a strategic position. There was a lot of thin film work, and so there's this promise that thin films, they can be, they were for a while much lower cost than, and they probably still are lower cost, but not price relative to silicon, and they have the potential for that performance. Well, then let's demonstrate or test whether or not that performance exists. And that was the primary motivation really behind that program. And we're also forcing people to come from different communities and put everything in, from modeling to growing perfect crystals in practical ways and so on and so forth. So this is not meant to be a practical cell that will be manufactured, just really a model system platform. Along the same lines, and this is something that it's easier for me now to put into context because of Jeffrey's talk earlier, a program that we also are in the process now of selecting awards is called PREDICT. And while some work had gone into studying the reliability of photovoltaic systems, at least for me coming from world of condensed matter physics of other materials, I looked at it and I said, well, people don't really know why this is happening. They know things deteriorate under certain conditions and may or may not even have the correlation, but the causation was not there. And so, and this is also a program that we launched together with CSP, because if you can imagine at really, really high temperatures, materials, understanding materials, reliability is really important for CSP folks. So together with CSP, really we're looking at physics-based predictive models for both CSP and separately for CSP and for PV materials components of the entire module. Right? Separate topic, and I think Jeffrey also mentioned microinverters, because now there is, people are expecting that, so microinverters are not still the bulk of the inverter market, they're growing, and we don't know anything about their failure rates. And you saw how much of the system, well, when you do project financing for a system, the inverter reserve is a very significant part of that project reserve. So now you have more of these. They're a lot harder to access. They're not centralized and so on and so forth, and they're new. And so there's part here that's focusing on microinverter reliability as well. How does that help? So as I said earlier, the dollar a watt really comes from 5 cents kilowatt hour. The duration of the project, the tenor of your debt that you might get for the project finance is going to be impacted by how often you have to replace the components. And so that directly impacts your overall LCOE. It also impacts bankability. And so for us, what's really important is also, if we think that certain technology we're funding is the next best thing, and we'd like to launch it in the field, there has to be a banker who's going to believe that this is going to last. And so this is where predictability and reliability is really important. Just not in terms of the actual programs that we're running there, but because it's before I switch to talking about the industry and the work that we fund in companies, I also wanted to mention NREL. I think you had Art Nozick speaking yesterday. So Art is in a part of NREL that is actually a smaller part that's funded by the Office of Science, and so they do a lot of fundamental work in PV in general in the energy conversion space. There is an entity at NREL called National Center for Photovoltaics, and that's where the bulk of the work, the bulk of our funding actually goes, and the bulk of the PV work that goes out in NREL. So they do anything from advanced characterization techniques to CdTe, CIGS, silicon, and so on and so forth. What I wanted to highlight is that NREL is a lab that, and Art may have shown you the history of funding and number of people with as it went up and down with politics, but in the last 20 years or so, a lot of infrastructure investment has gone into NREL, and NREL has some very unique capabilities that I think research community can certainly take advantage of. Since they had fallen under my portfolio, the major change in direction has been to try to get them to partner with outside entities a lot. And so we have several new modes of partnering, if you will, and they do work with international organizations as well. And for them, it's actually even easier than, to collaborate with either universities or in some cases, companies in the outside of the US. So the non-proprietary work that it might do, so research that you want to publish, is actually supported by us outright. Proprietary work has to be paid by partners, that's usually companies. And we also have two new types of fellowships, both for graduate students to come and work for, say, 6 months during their PhD program, and for postdocs who want to come from elsewhere, because actually NREL's best mode of recruiting has been postdocs, in fact. And then for some bizarre historical reasons, they were not allowed to actually for solicitations that are open to everybody else in the field in the past. So now they do that, they can do that, and they partner with other entities in doing so, either as a lead or a sub. And as of this year, we're starting a mid-career scientist exchange program with Fraunhofer ISE. So this is the Fraunhofer in Germany, and with the Japan Institute for Standards and Technology on the topic of solar. And so we are hoping that if that works out in terms of just ironing out some of the bureaucratic issues, that we'll hopefully try to do that strategically with multiple centers of excellence around the world. It's a field that needs a lot of brains put together. So that's really the idea behind that. Okay, so what else does DOE and SunShot do? So now we're really switching. The vast majority of our recipients are actually companies. We help companies do R&D and demos. This is a curve that shows, where does money come in for different types of activities, for research, prototypes, pilot line, commercialization, and so on. Government puts in a lot of money in the activities that I just described. And I can tell you that actually this venture capital part here that used to take over maybe at the pilot line, post-prototype stage, it's not there actually anymore. So we're also trying to see how we can fill that gap. But the two gaps that were easy to identify for a very long time was this pre-commercial gap, and later I will briefly mention commercialization gap, where you're really trying to go at scale. If you are, and what I'm addressing here is manufacturing for the most part. This was motivated by manufacturing of cells or modules or components of modules, right? So to address this first gap, we started a program called the Incubator program, and we're now actually in the middle of round 8, selections for round 8, where we don't, so Incubator in the traditional sense is a place where you can bring in a company, and ours would really be more accurately characterized as an accelerator in a private sphere. So we award company anywhere from, depending on what they're doing, 1 to 4 million or so, with equal matching from them. 12 to 18 month program is typical, and they have to advance through stages of development. They have to hit certain milestones, and they don't actually get paid until they hit those milestones. And so partly because of the way the program is structured, and it's a very competitive program, we actually have had the companies just in a round 1, so now we're in round 8. So we don't have all of the data, because this is actually all public data that has come out from public filings. The company in first round received about 17 million from DOE. The follow-on funding was more like on the order of 1.7 or 8 billion. And so we're starting to see some things that TetraSun got acquired by First Solar, for example, was in our incubator round 6. They just graduated last summer. So that has been a very interesting, very, very successful program. But what we did with it was when we went from that round 1 to round 6, we've opened it up to other solar topics. We had one round that was addressing only soft cost, and now Incubator is really our open FOA, if you will. So we'll take anything that anybody proposes. We have different tiers. And so tier 1 you'll build a prototype. Tier 2, you'll go to a pilot line. You can get a different amount of money, and you can, come up with a new kind of a PV cell, or you can come up with a new database that does, say, reverse auction for finding installers and customers in the solar space, the residential solar installations. Switching gears, actually making a connection back to the R&D work that we've been funding, because the solar program has been around for as long as Department of Energy has been around, in the 70s. In that amount of time, and we've actually added some more, the researchers that were supported by DOE were part of over about 50% of the world record cells. This is the NREL chart, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with the NREL chart of record efficiencies. So part of our mission is advancing the field. The mission at the moment is to try to get the cost of solar down. That's very important. But we are funded by taxpayer money, and there's definitely a very important role that government agencies play, which is a return on that investment in form of economic activity, namely jobs. And so how did we do in that space in that amount of time? The US actually has not done very well at all in retaining the production of the innovation that has happened in the United States. And so this is not just the US. This has happened in the PV space, actually in general. Different countries have done better or worse in different types of industries, but in PV in general, even Europe has seen their share slide quite a bit. And in fact, the trend of where PV is installed versus where it's made, there is no correlation. It's actually anti-correlated. I think Japan is the only one that has a trade balance in that space. So, there are plenty of very smart people who argue that, why should we care about that? Still, as long as the price of modules going down, and clearly the cost is going down with lower labor, and we're installing more, and we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we're still supporting research at universities, we're doing fine, right? Well, we don't think that actually is going to help the field. We know from other industries that trying to co-locate R&D and manufacture is incredibly important to shorten the learning cycle, and ultimately to create jobs, right? So if you actually look at number of jobs created and careers, more importantly, right? And that's a whole other domain. Per dollar invested in, say, installation space versus manufacturing space, you do want manufacturing jobs. And then more importantly, it's this cycle of learning and advancing the industry a little bit faster. In particular, so what do we do in the manufacturing space? One of the first programs that, under SunShot at least, that was funded was a set of 3 entities, one consortium that was based on supply chain and SIGs, that's PVMC. So the idea was to, and actually it is co-led by Semitech, but it was meant to mimic Semitech that had done that for the semiconductor space. Another one is a company that formerly was called SVTC. Actually, the parent company was called SVTC. The project itself is meant to set a pilot line, a service silicon line, because right now we don't have a line where you can go in and say, I have a new idea on how to do thin crystalline silicon, and I'd like to process it all the way. There isn't a line that can support that. A lot of our startups are sending things overseas. And the third one is a consortium that is academic research, led by Stanford and Berkeley. It has an industrial advisory board. And it ranges from manufacturing-related research to some of the early stage stuff. The other things that we had actually done in that space, recognizing that not all innovation and this module-related is centered on the absorber, there's a lot of materials innovation in the entire supply chain, is actually to look at these high-impact supply chain solutions ranging from tool manufacturers to materials companies like 3M. So we fund R&D programs in those companies as well. And then we also dabbled in helping companies, and I'll say dabbled, I'll explain why, helping companies actually build factories and scale up. We are not the multi-billion-dollar loan program that I'm sure most of the people heard about because of Solyndra. Our budget is not that large, so the grants but the important part is that we give out grants, we don't give loans. And so the idea was to help companies at a critical stage but with the money that's not meant to be returned, but put in enough project management structure that that money is still well spent. We had one round of that program that we called SunPath, and that happened last year. We gave 3 awards, and just because we had been talking about CPV, and I noticed there was a whole session here on multi-junctions, I think yesterday. 2 companies were in a CPV space. So Solar Junction got a grant to expand their line to go with a foundry. Soitec is a company from Europe, actually, that's building a factory in California for their systems because they have a huge pipeline of PPAs in the United States. And 1366 is a company that is making a direct wafer, direct polysilicon wafer, direct from melt, as opposed to cutting it. And they are expanding their production with going from a prototype to a production tool. So we did that last year, and we decided not to do this year, for example. And we decided not just because it gobbles up enormous amount of money. Originally, we had committed $50 million to that. Didn't quite utilize all of that year. But the reason is that, and I'll get to the reason in a minute. So what are we actually doing? We're funding R&D in manufacturing, a program that we also just currently are because of the cycle in the selection process. SolarMat is meant to fund R&D innovation in manufacturing for sort of the next generation, for the next cycle of products. Why aren't we funding companies? Still not on that slide. Okay, another example of where we're also helping companies manufacture. And transition to manufacturing is, this is an awardee from the Incubator program, Robotics, that has a tracker that is not affixed to each of the modules, but in fact it goes around and adjusts the modules with enough frequency to actually be useful, but it cuts down the cost by about 50% for the tracker alone, and I think about 30% for the system overall. So they will be manufacturing in the United States. And they have slightly lower hurdle in terms of the CapEx. If you haven't, I don't know if anybody has discussed market situation right now and PV production in the world and so on, but what is happening and what will be happening for a few years is that we will have much, much more capacity to manufacture photovoltaics than we will be installing. So these are the actual projections. The average, even best case scenario, shows that capacity may be being used in 2 years, but most likely that capacity, I mean, it is being idled right now. It'll probably be shut down in a lot of cases. And so the point of this slide is that nobody should be building new factories right now. And so that's one of the reasons why we didn't repeat that program this year. If we think strategically and you say, well, we would still like to do that someday, not just we, United States and DOE supporting that, but people in the world should want to do the next generation photovoltaics. And so what is the next generation photovoltaic product and what should I be building? Right? I mean, there's plenty of places where the costs still need to be taken out of manufacturing, but we are really emphasizing the innovative part. And so there has to be a lot more innovation put into processing and materials, automation, any number of things to actually get to the goals that we've set out by the end of the decade now. If you look at what's happening, the part that we actually find very troubling right now is that if you look at the companies across the PV supply chain, those that are in equipment, wafers, inverters, you name it, right? In fact, every one of those segments has had negative operating margins for a while now. And we're not, because the competition is so fierce, and we're seeing some costs leveling, some prices are leveling off. Basically, everybody is operating at a very large loss. And that's okay when you're growing for a little while, but you can't do that all the time. What's also happening is that because of that trend, these companies are not investing in innovation. Nobody has money in the private sector right now to invest in innovation, certainly not in the kind of innovation that is going to be impactful. And so these are the numbers not from us. These are numbers from multiple financial analysts showing the projections of where they think, in this case, this is the crystalline silicon module experience curve actually leveling off relative to what's been happening so far and the expected efficiencies. And as I said, the SunShot module target assumes a module of 20% efficiency and price of 50 cents a watt. That means you have to make some money. That means it has to cost you well below, hopefully well below 50 cents a watt. So to us, it's really important to keep up with the programs that are going to be addressing really differentiated solutions and products and materials in every one of those pieces of the supply chain that I just mentioned. It also makes a case for when you actually say, well, what are these things that need to happen to innovate, to get to those lower costs, right? We have a very large team of analysts at NREL that have been working a lot on cost analysis for a very long time. They're now jointly working with MIT on this analysis. And cross-comparing, they're actually comparing this with everybody else's, so not doing this in a vacuum. Some of this innovation, in fact, will equalize, and this is just the case study that was done for US versus China in 2011, different costs broken down, will equalize some of the regional advantages that exist. The interesting thing is actually it will equalize regional advantages, or it will erase regional advantages everywhere. So that means the long-term trend probably will be wherever there's a market, you will want to manufacture there. So you win some, you lose some, right? At least from our perspective, but that's an interesting trend. The part that I think is important and that we also need to tackle, and we do tackle, and I'll switch to the entire whole other topic after this, is that when you're manufacturing overseas and installing here, you will always have this yellow piece here. For those, I'm sorry if you can't distinguish that, that's shipping to US, the cost of shipping. The other part also, just to recognize, these numbers are the actual cost of manufacturing modules, silicon modules. These numbers are from public disclosures of Chinese companies, and this is from work that was done proprietary with the companies that are manufacturing in the United States. They're selling at 60 to 70 cents, so that gives you an idea of the loss that these companies are experiencing because of the enormous pressure of just oversupply and overcapacity in the market. What we would like to see is this entirely erased. And how do you, if you can't erase it, next best thing is to make it a larger fraction of the overall system cost. And so the way you do that is you reduce the cost of the entire system. If you look at, for example, the trends across all of the sectors, residential, commercial, and utility, in the last 4 years, the cost of the system, the actual prices that you've been seeing, in fact, there has been enormous reduction, but almost 90% of those cost reductions have come from the module and some of the installer operating cost reductions, right? So everything other than the module, and inverters have also come down too, has not contributed significantly to that reduction. And so now this has actually become a very large focus of our program. This is what we call the soft costs. And so how do you reduce the soft cost, and can we actually do anything about that? Here's one reason why the soft costs have not budged. This is not quite hypothetical. This is actually very close to one actual city's process for permitting solar. If you want to put solar on your house or on a commercial building, you will have to follow an algorithm like this. And you'll have to go to multiple agencies and file multiple paperwork, and very often paperwork, not an online form. So clearly more paperwork and more complicated procedures mean more cost. A lot of that burden is borne by installers, right? So they can't cut that out if they have to have somebody hanging around these offices all the time checking on what's happening with the application. To make things worse, if you want to take advantage of and you want to make your business efficient and go across the United States, those processes are very, very different. We have 18,000 local jurisdictions that have a say over what needs to be done if you want to install solar. So how do you make your business processes uniform in those cases? We also cannot issue a decree that every jurisdiction is going to do things in the same way. Utilities have a lot to do with how fast things are done. And in the United States, the utility space is not only numerous relative to and because we'll be mentioning Germany that has a few utilities, we have thousands. We have regulated utilities, unregulated utilities, we have co-ops and unis, and everybody's operating in a totally different way. To contrast that process with what Germany had done, and this is really, really important to understand, why does Germany have, in addition to the subsidies that they had for production, why were they successful? The cost of solar has also gone down a lot, and that's not going to be going up probably anytime soon. The module costs the same, the inverter costs a little bit less in Europe, but it's everything else, and we're looking at 50% of the system cost of what is in the U.S. on homes. The last numbers that I had seen reported last fall were about 210, 220. Just yesterday I was having a conversation with somebody saying that in Germany they're installing commercial systems, so not utility tens or hundreds of megawatts, commercial systems for the equivalent of $1.70, right? The module costs the same. So that's a one-step process. The electrician that installs it is certified to deem the system safe, and nobody else has to come and inspect it again and again and again. So there's a lot of inefficiency in the system at the moment. What have we done is to have sort of a competition, have a funding opportunity competition for the teams of jurisdictions, utilities, and local stakeholders to improve their processes. And so this is similar to the race to the top, called the Rooftop Solar Challenge, and we just went through the second round saying who can do this best, and we'll give you money to try to maximize that. And we're actually seeing very interesting statistical correlation on proliferation, a number of installers showing up and operating in the areas where these awards were given, because the process is already improving. So that's one example of what we can do without being able to mandate policy or regulate anything. Another example is another incubator awardee, Simply Civic. They have built web-based permitting system that any utility can adopt, and so you can track your permits in real time and eliminate the time it takes to go back and forth and do this. For example, Sun Number, they used to be called Urban Glue, pre-maps homes in a certain area so that a customer acquisition cost for an installer is lowered. That's another non-hardware cost that can be addressed through technology. And then there are other costs. There's coming back to bankability and reliability and durability. I think Jeffrey mentioned the system of regional test centers that we have. National lab staff is actually helping manufacturers set up and monitor better than you would in a regular power generating facility the reliability and performance of their systems. And so this is giving them a real-time track record they can go to the developer with and say, look, my system really works well under these conditions, and if they need different climates, they can go to any one of these locations and install their systems. Another way that, and Jeffrey didn't talk about this, but Fraunhofer is one of the two awardees, and this is a program that just started, so there's not much to talk about in terms of what was done. The vision was to have PV someday be treated as an appliance that you would buy for your home. You buy a fridge, you plug it in, end of story. Even a water heater does not need as much inspection as a PV system does. And so the solution in that space is not just, there's the safety part that is addressed by some of the safety standards, but it's also, can you have a PV-ready plug on a new home? What does this look like on the utility side so that you don't have to wait for the interconnection permit and things like that? So as I said, this is a brand new program. It's just starting, so not a lot to talk about in concrete terms, but it is another way of addressing the soft cost part. And then finally, last summer, we announced the SunShot Prize, where the first team to get to a certain scale, about 1,000 homes, with $1 a watt soft costs, so that's then plus modules, wins $10 million. And so this is meant to be modeled after the X Prize and all of the other prizes. It is a very, very difficult goal to achieve within the amount of time that we've set. But we're hoping that even if there are teams that are trying to get there and get close to that, it'll be a great success. Coming back to, why are we doing all of this? I mean, despite what some people have thought to be a very difficult and maybe a very negative year for solar industry, and despite the less and less, investment in all parts of the supply chain, including installations, the overall value of US PV installations has gone up. Last year was about 11 billion. And the number of jobs that is primarily dominated by the installations has also gone up. And so we would really like to amplify that. And if you look at the potential for the market growth, I mean, that could really be huge. For the companies that are competing for the SunShot prize, that their prize is not the 10 million. Their prize is going from, this is the case of solar penetration if nothing changes. When we started the SunShot, we did a model of showing, so what happens if the prices go on as they have in the past. At best, you might have 1.5% of electrical demand in the United States in capacity come from solar. That would mean tenfold from where we are now. So it's not peanuts. But if you actually got to 5 cents a kilowatt hour, I mean, the prize is 14% of the electrical demand in the United States. And so that is why we started SunShot in general. And I'm hoping that we have question time, at least for a few minutes.